A line in T.S. Eliot's strange and unhappy poem, The Hollow Men, says, "This is the way the world ends, not with a bang, but a whimper." In the New Testament stories about Jesus' resurrection, how do the disciples' experiences of Jesus after his resurrection end? Do they end with a bang or with a whimper? I think studying the canonical evidence makes it clear that they end with a bang, not with a whimper. In this series, we're investigating how well or how poorly a theory of apparitions, especially bereavement apparitions, fits with the evidence that we find in the New Testament stories, if we just take that evidence even as what the early disciples claimed happened. Now, I realize that it's not granted by scholars, as we will see today, that that's what they claimed. Not granted by, that is to say, more liberal scholars, even that that's what they claimed. But the purpose of this series has been, if we look at what we find there is at least what they claimed, does the bereavement apparition theory fit with that? Because scholar Dale Allison is often implying that it does fit at least pretty well, or to an extent that is significant and a helpful parallel, etc. And again, and we'll see another instance today, he has to twist what's found in the biblical accounts and not even take them seriously as what was claimed or believed by the earliest Christians, but then also misinterpret them and mispresent them and misdescribe them in order to make it sound like the bereavement apparition idea has a better fit than it really does. Now, some years ago, Dr. Allison did a symposium. He was in a symposium in Philosophia Christi where various other scholars were disagreeing with him and they were going back and forth. I like such symposia, and I like the fact that at least at that time those scholars were actually disagreeing more forthrightly with Allison. It was more focused on, criticizing his views, disagreeing with his views. The rhetorical emphasis has really shifted, and to the point that, as I was noting in a blog post that I wrote and published recently, even William Lane Craig is now just sort of saying all of these super positive things about Allison and what a great scholar he is and how significant it is that he admits the appearance to the 12 and so on and so on. You could say that's a difference of emphasis, but it's a pretty big difference of emphasis. In any event, in that symposium, Habermas writes something in response to Gary Habermas's argument that the early Christians seem to have made a distinction between resurrection appearances and other visions. And this is what Allison writes there. "Of the reports I received of apparitions of my late father, half came during the week immediately following his death, and all came during the following months, and nothing has happened since. This appears to be typical." So Allison again takes this apparition literature very seriously as what people really experience, not even just what they claim, but what they really experience, and he's saying that's typical. Now, once more, playing devil's advocate, can we not, in the light of the apparitional literature, posit that, in accord with the statistics on apparitions, the visions of Jesus occurred during the first days or weeks after his death, and that they soon faded, or that there were few, if any, during subsequent months or years, perhaps even until Paul's vision, and further that, once the pre-Pauline confession behind 1 Corinthians 15 had been drawn up, perhaps very early on, later reports of seeing Jesus, which were not foundational for the faith, would naturally have been thought of as belonging to some other category. This does not seem like a stretch to me. Notice that we've dropped playing devil's advocate. Now we're just saying this just doesn't seem like a stretch to him. which means that Gary's third way of distinguishing the encounters with Jesus from the encounters with post-mortem others needs further elaboration and defense. End quote. Again, in the 2021 book, it's very clear that Allison is not merely playing devil's advocate, but that not that he necessarily thinks that everything exactly happened as he's suggesting it here, but that he's definitely throwing out the canonical evidence on the Ascension and how long Jesus was there, and if there was a distinction between visions and Jesus actually appearing bodily, because everything where Jesus appears in a clearly bodily way is something that Allison's very definite was a later apologetic addition. So what he writes here and in 2021 seems to indicate that he doesn't think that the disciples even claimed a sharp shift due to Jesus' ascension, like a sharp shift from, okay, it was bodily because he was on earth for a limited period of time, and then later he only would appear in visionary ways. He doesn't think that's even what they originally claimed. And we'll notice as we go throughout how a maximal data approach is really helpful here. And there were other places in that symposium where I think that really came out, because Dr. Habermas, of course, using a minimal facts account, could not consistently access some of the things that he was trying to access about, Jesus' appearances, and Allison called him on that in other quotes. Now, as it turns out, Allison does actually think that the disciples didn't even claim a sharp shift after a series of bodily appearances over a period of weeks to then his ascending into heaven. He says in his 2021 book, the first Christians probably did not imagine significant chronological space between Jesus' resurrection, ascension, and enthronement in heaven. Allison himself, because he's an objective vision theorist, thinks that Jesus ascended very abruptly, like left the space-time continuum right after his resurrection, and then did not appear bodily to his disciples, that they only had vision-like experiences, and that even phenomenologically, their experiences as groups were not robustly bodily in type. And I've read some of those quotes in the course of this series. Allison also confirmed this to philosopher Philip Goff, who takes a somewhat similar position, and Goff mentioned that on Cameron Bertuzzi's Capturing Christianity. Allison's arguments that the early Christians, the first Christians, probably thought Jesus ascended much sooner than Acts portrays resembles something that was said by the late historian Paul Meyer. Not to be confused with John Meyer. This is Paul Meyer, the Christian historian who used to teach here at Western Michigan University. My husband Tim recently reminded me of what Paul Meyer had said, and it went something like this. You first read through the canonical Gospels, then you grab some late Gnostic source and mash the content of that late source together with what you find in the canonical Gospels. Then you look at the result, and if it still looks too much like what happens in the Gospels, you lose. So you have to try again. And that's exactly what Allison does here. In fact, it's an uncanny resemblance. So he throws out the Acts account in Acts 1 that Jesus was on earth for approximately 40 days and that then he ascended into heaven in the presence of his disciples. He disregards all the evidence that Acts comes from a companion of Paul and from a person who was conscientious about the truth. He thinks this is all merely invented. He gives two quote-unquote arguments for this. First, truly eyebrow-raising argument from silence. He says that the only explicit early references we have to Jesus' ascension occur in Luke. This is at the very end. It's just narrated so fast that there are no details. And I think at that time, Luke may not have known how long Jesus was on earth. I don't think Luke is implying there that it happened on the same day, but it's not much of a narration to speak of. Then the long ending of Mark, and then Acts. Now, Allison's right that these are the three earliest explicit mentions of Jesus' ascension. I mean, that's, two of them written by the same author, but still, we've got mentions of Jesus' ascension. But then he says that there is no earlier trace of their specific content. So aside from the documents that we have, we don't have any other documents. Right. I mean, that's tautological. That doesn't create an argument that this is made up. The argument he gives, other than that, is that Jesus' words in Acts 1 about spreading the gospel to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the world reflect a Lucan theme. And of course, we're not allowed to even consider the possibility that it was a Lucan theme because Luke believed that Jesus actually said it. That's not even on the table. So those are his reasons for just throwing out Luke's account, not even recording what the early Christians believed. He's very explicit about that. He thinks they probably believed that there was very little chronological space between Jesus' resurrection and his ascension. He also says something to the effect that Jesus' ascension, like his resurrection, is sometimes treated as conveying his vindication. It's a mystery as to why that should mean that they thought there was virtually no chronological time in between them. I mean, modern conservative Christians think that Jesus' ascension conveys his vindication. The Anglican tradition that I was a member of for many years, and still, in some sense, am a member of, really emphasized the ascension, connected it with reigning and songs about Jesus reigning and so forth. And it never would have crossed my mind that meant that it had, supposedly had to occur earlier than 40 days after his resurrection. Why would you even think that? Then Allison tries to replace the evidence in Acts 1, the explicit evidence in an early document by a companion of Paul about when Jesus ascended, with his own interpretation of later non-canonical texts with far less historical claim. So this is in a footnote. One of these texts, which I think he's misinterpreting anyway, is the Apology of Aristides from the early 2nd century. Aristides said he died and was buried, and they say that after 3 days he rose and ascended to heaven. Thereupon these 12 disciples went forth throughout the known parts of the world and kept showing his greatness with all modesty and uprightness. This is clearly part of a brief creed-like summary. And, Allison just quotes the after 3 days he rose and ascended to heaven and presents it as if Aristides is saying that he ascended to heaven also on the 3rd day. But it's a very brief summary, very much like the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed, right? Which say things like, he rose again the 3rd day according to the scriptures and ascended into heaven. Those of us who have stood around in a liturgical church and recited that in a group, again, never thought for a moment that we were saying that those happened on the same day. Why would you even think that? All right. So even as a 2nd century document, that's not evidence of Christian belief that Jesus ascended. An original, early, first Christian belief that Jesus ascended on the same day that he rose. He uses a quotation from the Gospel of Peter, so-called Gospel of Peter, from the second half of the 2nd century, and there the angels do appear to be telling the women at the tomb that Jesus has ascended to heaven. But so what? Here we are again with Paul Meyer's statement. You make a mashup of the canonical Gospels and some late Gnostic text, and then you look at it, and if it looks too much like what we have in the canonical Gospels, you lose. All right. And then he uses a snippet from an old Latin manuscript called Codex Babiensis that inserts something into the account of the empty tomb in Mark 16. I did a deep dive into this and into the content of Codex Babiensis. We don't know how old this interpolated verse is. Some have suggested that it may date back to the time of Cyprian, not the specific manuscripts we have. Those are much later, but that the content of the text may date back to the time of Cyprian in the 3rd century. Even that is very conjectural. And even the text of this insertion has variants. Okay, so very, very shaky. Now, the inserted verse may have said, but suddenly at the 3rd hour of the day, there was darkness over the whole circle of the earth, and angels descended from the heavens, and as he, which would mean the Lord, if this is what the text says, was rising in the glory of the living God, at the same time they ascended with him, and immediately it was light. Okay. Now, this has no claim to be what was believed by the earliest Christians, and it certainly doesn't have anything like the claim that the account in Acts 1, with a clear provenance and a clear author and so forth, has to be what the earliest Christians believed. And even this may mean that the angels were ascending with Jesus out of the tomb. Even in this Old Latin version, in verse 7, the angel tells the women that Jesus is going ahead into Galilee. So again, that, going ahead seems to imply that he's on earth, that he, going to travel between locations on earth. So, there are multiple reasons why this doesn't give us any kind of good evidence of that the early Christians thought that Jesus, rose and immediately went up to heaven. Okay. Then, as if to try to shore up this bad argument from later sources, Allison makes a truly jaw-dropping eisegesis of Jesus' appearance in Matthew 28. So this is a pattern we've seen, right? Misdescribing what's found in the canonical evidence to try to sort of massage the evidence itself to make it fit better with Allison's own theory. And he says, when in Matthew 28, 16 through 20, the risen Jesus declares that he has received all authority in heaven and on earth, it can only be because he has already ascended and received heavenly rule. Jaw dropped. It can only be. What? Okay. So he's rejecting the account of the Ascension after 40 days in Acts as a made-up story, but here he's doing, it's pure, very subjective theology about what Matthew was conveying theologically, saying that when Jesus says all authority has been given to me in heaven and in earth, in Matthew 28, this must mean, in some sense must mean in Matthew's account, in Matthew's story, that Jesus has already ascended. Now, why would you even think that for a moment? Again, those of us who have taken seriously the New Testament evidence, thousands, if not millions of us have, I think rightly, never for a moment thought, oh my goodness, this is like some kind of weird inconsistency with Acts 1. Jesus must have already ascended, or he wouldn't say, all authority in heaven and earth has been given unto me, Go therefore, teach all nations, and so forth. Wow, weird. And I think that's right. I think that's reasonable. I'm not just saying, well, nobody's ever thought it, so it must be right. But it's just almost beyond comprehension why Allison would say something so strong. This must be because he's already, can only be because he's already ascended. Even prior to Jesus' death, in the Gospel of Matthew, he exhibits enormous authority. He has authority over demons. He has authority over the wind and the waves. He has authority over interpretation of the law. He has authority over illness. Moreover, in Matthew's own accounts of the empty tomb and the appearance to the women are told first at the tomb by an angel that Jesus is going ahead into Galilee. Again, this seems to imply that he's on earth. And then the women actually see Jesus and they're able to grasp his fate. This is one of the things that Allison declares in a different part of the book is an apologetic invention. But it, at a minimum, conveys what Matthew thought about whether Jesus was, already ascended to heaven or whether he was on earth, and what Matthew was portraying. So why would you interpret Jesus' statement, all authority is given unto me, to mean he'd already ascended in Matthew? And in the very incident in which Jesus says that all authority in heaven and earth has been given unto him, as I pointed out in an earlier video in this series, he comes to the disciples in contradiction to Allison's statement that in the canonical Gospels, as in apparitions, the apparition does not approach. He does. He approaches. There are two places in the canonical accounts where he approaches. Different words are used. One of them is here in Matthew 28, and the other is when he approaches the travelers on the road to Emmaus. Allison's eisegesis of Matthew 28:18 is the sheerest foot-stomping. He doesn't even bother to present any other argument. He just asserts that Jesus' declaration about authority can only be because he's already ascended. He's, in fact, unable to find any support in the canonical works for the idea that Jesus ascended prior to appearing to the disciples, so he invents this and declares it by fiat to be the only interpretation of Matthew 28:18 in an attempt to find something other than late, non-canonical support for his own ideas. Now, in the quotation I gave close to the beginning from the Symposium in Philosophy of Christi, Allison also suggests that plausibly there were later appearances that were similar in phenomenological type to the original appearances to the disciples, the apostles. Of course, he doesn't think that's a bodily type appearance anyway, but that they just weren't recorded because the creed that we find in 1 Corinthians 15 was already in place. This is, of course, an entirely evidence-free posit and also, of course, runs contrary to the explicit evidence in Acts 1 that we do have, which is that there was this set of appearances to the 11 and that ended then with Jesus' ascension. Now, this view is coherent across the New Testament writings. It's not just Luke can. Luke agrees with Matthew and John in narrating bodily type appearances to the first disciples. And then in Luke's writing, this is in contrast to the non-earthly type appearance to Paul. Allison dismisses casually all the bodily type appearance stuff as apologetic, while ignoring the way that it fits with Luke's views. Okay, that in fact he did appear bodily for a time and then ceased to appear bodily, with the metaphysical cutoff point, Luke makes very explicit, being the Ascension. Again, in Acts, they don't seem to be expecting to have any more meals with Jesus. They know that he's gone. Notice, too, that Paul, in his epistles, does not indicate that he had a bodily type experience. When he refers to knowing a man, which may be himself, who had special experiences, he refers to that person as being taken up into heaven. Under the historical reportage model, if instead of trying to ditch or even twist the earliest evidence and put something else in its place, we can see that apparition stories and the way that bereavement apparitions tail off doesn't fit with what the disciples originally claimed. Let me point something out here. if the bodily type stories in the Gospels were just developments, apologetic developments, why do we have Paul's story at all in Acts, which is so different? Okay, in all the narrations, 3 of them in Acts, of Paul's story on the road to Damascus, it's clear that there's something, at least somewhat more vision-like, taking place. He doesn't have a meal with Jesus. Jesus doesn't come walking to him on the road, for example, as he comes walking up to the Emmaus disciples on the road. He doesn't do that on the road to Damascus. There's a light from heaven. The other people present with Paul, they may hear something, but it explicitly says they didn't see a man there. Even the intersubjective elements are far more limited than what you would expect in a bodily type experience. Now, if it's so common for apologetic reasons to develop the stories by adding bodily experiences, there could be a variety of different ways that this could go that would not make a distinction between the type of phenomenology that Paul apparently experienced and the type of phenomenology that the disciples apparently experienced. For example, Paul's experience could be rendered more bodily in type. As an assertion of his apostleship. If Luke was not averse to making stuff up, as Allison and skeptics obviously think, why not have Jesus approach Paul on the road and, show him his scars, for example, maybe even ask him for food, but at least, appear clearly to be right there on the earth with Paul. Why not do that? Or Luke could have gone in a different direction. He could have had Jesus' other apostles from time to time after the Ascension have bodily type experiences, maybe meals with Jesus, but state that this was something that would only happen with the 11 because they were the leaders. John Dominic Crossan says that so much of this is just about power within the early church and so forth, and that ordinary Christians couldn't have these. And there are a variety of ways that the stories could develop that wouldn't preserve this story of Paul having a different type of experience. In fact, liberal scholars and skeptics have repeatedly used the somewhat different nature of the phenomenology of Paul's experience as described in all the accounts from the bodily accounts as an argument that Jesus never appeared bodily to the other disciples. And that possibility could have been ruled out by a different development of the story if in fact it was a development. In contrast, if we take seriously the evidence that the author of Acts and the authors of the other Gospels were at least conscientious people who weren't just making things up, and that they were close enough to what happened to be able at least to give us a good account of what the original sources claimed, then we've got a sharp cutoff. Already in Acts 2 and 3, Peter is telling people in his speeches that Jesus has left, that Jesus isn't here anymore, and that he's not going to come back until, the big apocalyptic time when he comes back. They don't seem to expect Jesus to be just sort of walking in the door or even suddenly showing up in the midst of them and asking for honeycomb to eat. What Allison himself indicates is that the apparition literature doesn't feature groups of people doing this. Groups of people saying that they had a group experience in which the loved one, or a series of group experiences in which the loved one was first apparently here on earth or seemed to be present very bodily, but then disappeared in some special way, which they were explicitly told meant that he was going away and that they shouldn't expect him to show up and just to be encountering him in these bodily-like ways anymore. According to Allison's own account, that doesn't seem to be what we get in the apparition literature as claims. Instead, they go away not with a bang but a whimper. It just stops naturally. Once again, we find that without twisting and dismissing the evidence of the canonical sources, they are not a good fit. The claims found in them as claims are not a good fit for the apparition literature, the bereavement apparition literature, even taken on its own terms. Next time, I plan to wrap up this series with one more difference and a conclusion. I want you to notice how bad Allison's arguments are here, because he's so respected, and so many, I would almost say fawning comments are made about what a wonderful scholar Allison is, but his arguments are terrible. Nobody who makes these kinds of really weak arguments should be that highly respected. And I think that bespeaks a major problem in the New Testament discipline, that he is so well respected as such a great scholar, because honestly, to be a great scholar, you should be making much stronger arguments than this. Okay, come back next time. Be sure to like and subscribe to the Lydia McGrew channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.